So should you use a vitamin D supplement? It's estimated that between 15 and 60% of the world's population, depending on where in the world you are, is vitamin D deficient. So the logical thing you might think is to take a vitamin D supplement, an oral supplement. What we're going to be doing in this video is breaking down vitamin D and how you should be getting it naturally, and why taking it in an oral form as a supplement might not be the best idea. Most people are trying to make it sound like pretty straightforward, just take a tablet and that's going to solve all your problems. But as you're going to find out in this video, there's a little bit more that meets the eye to vitamin D supplementation. What's up guys, it's Nick Kutsia here and welcome to the Mitochondria YouTube channel. On this channel you're going to find content all around light, circadian rhythms, and how you can hack these things in order to live your best life. If you haven't already done so, please make sure that you hit both the subscribe and the notification bell so that you get notified as soon as we release new content. So for today's video, we're going to be talking about vitamin D and whether or not you should supplement it, and most specifically in the oral form, but we'll also talk about supplementing it with your light environment. But just to start, I just want to give a quick overview. Vitamin D, even though it is named a vitamin, it's actually a hormone, and it is tremendously important for your health, from your immune system to having strong bones, healthy skin. There's really so many benefits to having optimal levels of vitamin D. And the big problem is that it's estimated between 15 and 60% of the world's population is vitamin D deficient. And that could be based on, what region you're living in. Asian countries tend to have the highest prevalence of vitamin D deficiency, and that's often just because they're not getting outside and not getting enough natural light, but there's many factors that go into it. So what I want to basically discuss today is we're going to discuss three different headings or overview points that you might want to consider before you start using a vitamin D supplement. The first one is going to be, how would you have naturally gotten vitamin D? How did your ancestors get vitamin D? Obviously they weren't deficient. There's a certain level they were achieving, and how did they do this without having to take any vitamin D tablets? Then the second section, we're going to jump into the seasonality of vitamin D, and that's obviously going to be touching on your light environment. And the third point, a very important point, is to do with your genetics, because based on your own heritage or where you're from, you might need higher or lower levels of vitamin D, or you might find it easier to get the same amount or more vitamin D than someone else with some different genetic makeup. So the two ways that you can make vitamin D, most people know it's through sunlight exposure. So this is primarily, or it is actually to do with UVB light exposure. What basically happens is when ultraviolet B, UVB light comes into contact with your skin, you'll convert cholesterol into vitamin D. Now this is a very different pathway to when you're getting it either in a supplement form or even in foods. There are certain foods that contain healthy amounts of vitamin D, things like oily fish, red meat, mushrooms also. But what you need to understand is that there's two very different pathways that happen when you're getting vitamin D in these two different instances. So this should answer the question almost off the bat. Should you be taking a vitamin D supplement? If your problem is that you're not getting enough ultraviolet light exposure, you're not getting outside enough, then you've got bigger problems. You can't all of a sudden think you're just going to be taking a tablet or eating a whole bunch of food that is vitamin D fortified in order to make up for this pathway that you're skipping, because now you're not actually converting any cholesterol into vitamin D. You're trying to use a completely different pathway in order to make up for something that should be happening naturally anyway. Now, those are the two mechanisms, but it is going to be important to understand that vitamin D through sunlight exposure will change based on the seasonality of your light environment. So one thing we need to consider is the seasonality of sunlight. So as we already mentioned, you need ultraviolet B or UVB light in order to convert cholesterol into vitamin D, and that process happens when UVB light hits your skin. But in nature, UVB light wouldn't have always been there. So depending on where in the world you are, if you're in a more northern or southern region, it's quite likely that there will be months where the sun will actually not be getting or delivering any UVB light to your region. So just for example, in England, in the winter months, there's actually a couple of months where you won't be getting any of that UVB light, and that means that that's not a natural time of the year for you to be getting vitamin D through your light environment. Now that doesn't mean to say that you should have extremely low vitamin D levels. You should have actually built up your vitamin D levels by getting enough of the ultraviolet B light exposure during summer. And then in those months, your diet should then be, full of those fortified foods. Fatty fish is a really good example, a really good source of vitamin D. That is something that your ancestors would have eaten in that region, especially in the winter months. So the seasonality, it will change. You can't really say that this much of my vitamin D must come from my light environment and this much must come from my food sources, because that will change based on seasonality and where in the world you are. If you're somewhere where you're in a more equatorial region, it's much more likely that you would have, UVB light 365 days of the year, and it would be a really dominant source of your vitamin D production, because you would have had that type of light always been exposed to it. So your genetic makeup is going to affect two different variables when it comes to your vitamin D supplementation. So the very first thing is, how much would your UVB light exposure have varied throughout the year? So myself, for example, I've done a genetic test and I'm 92% Northwestern European region, French and German. And for my ancestors and my genetic makeup, it makes a lot of sense to vary the amount of UVB light exposure that I get throughout the year. So in summer months, I can get a large amount of vitamin D from sunlight. And then in the winter months, it's actually okay if I don't get that much UVB light exposure or any, provided that I got enough UVB light exposure during that summer. Then in those months, the winter months, when there's no UVB light around, then it's completely fine for me to switch over to foods and start eating, things like fatty fish, just a really good example of an oral source of vitamin D. The other factor you need to consider based on your genetics, and this you can primarily tell based on your skin complexion. I burn very easily, I'm a lighter skin complexion, and what that means is that I can make vitamin D a lot quicker. If you're someone who's a darker complexion, then it means that you're going to require up to 4 times the amount of ultraviolet B light exposure in order to make the same amount of vitamin D. So consider your genetic makeup, whether or not you know it. You probably can guess based on your skin complexion if you were from a more northern or southern or more equatorial region. That's going to tell you, how much time you should be spending outside and whether or not you should be focusing on the seasonality factor in terms of your light environment. If you're someone who's from an equatorial region, then it is quite likely that UVB light exposure would have been, available to your ancestors throughout the year, and probably isn't something that you want to vary as much as someone such as myself, whose ancestors would have gone through that. So a really quick summary of today's video. You need to consider that there are 2 ways that your body can make vitamin D. It can be through your light environment and it can be through food sources, but you need to consider your genetics on whether or not you should be varying the amount of vitamin D that you get through your light environment. Someone such as myself, it would make sense that in summer months I would get a lot of UVB light exposure and a lot of vitamin D through my light environment. But then in the winter months, I can then start focusing on the foods. They're going to be my oral forms of vitamin D. If you're someone who's from a more equatorial region, then it makes sense that your light environment would be a more constant source of vitamin D throughout the year. And then just to end, another thing to consider is that your light environment is something that you can also supplement. You get tanning salons or you get UVB lights that you can use in order to create, basically to supplement this vitamin D production within your skin. And I just want to, end this video with a bit of caution that might not always be the best solution. Just like we were saying earlier, where it's not necessarily a good idea to try and eat a whole bunch of vitamin D in order to make up for not getting enough light exposure. On the other side of things as well, you need to understand that there's a certain context to using ultraviolet B light. So myself, for example, if it is completely normal for me to not get UVB light in winter, then if I start using a light in winter to try and make more vitamin D through my skin, then I'm actually creating a circadian mismatch, because that's not something that's normal for me. There are a lot of people who would do this because they're not getting enough, they're not building up enough vitamin D in the summer months. And we're never going to have a clear answer to whether or not that is a good idea. So to basically end, what I would say is that your number one choice, if you're someone who's got the seasonality factor of your light environment, such as myself, your number one choice is to do it naturally, get enough ultraviolet light exposure in summer months, then in the winter months switch over. But you shouldn't consider that, the best solution is to, just supplement with a light in the winter months when that's completely against what your ancestors would have done. And I know that's probably completely against the opposite of what most people say. They say just use the light and you can fix all your problems. But on this channel, we're talking about circadian rhythms, and the seasonality of things is really, really important, especially when you start tying in or considering that your light environment should match up with the type of food that you're eating if you're eating locally produced food. So that would be a whole nother topic to discuss, and if you guys want us to talk more about how your light environment ties in with the food that you're eating, then let us know in the comment section. But if you have any other questions from today's video, then let us know in the comment section as well. And just to quickly end this off, if you enjoyed the content from today's video, please make sure that you smash the thumbs up button. That lets us know that you're enjoying this kind of content and then fuels our fire to make more just like this for you. I know that we covered quite a broad topic, and this might not have given you the absolute clear answer for your case. So if you have questions based on it, then please feel free to drop them in the comment section and we will make sure to answer your questions. Other than that, I hope that you guys have a fantastic day further, and we will chat again soon. Cheers.